the 7 Years' War. So, class, today we will be examining one of the major wars to occur during the Enlightenment period. The war that will ultimately, as one of its unintended consequences, ignite a litany of revolutions. The 7 Years' War. So, let's talk about the basics of this war. It was fought between 1756 and 1763. The main belligerents were Prussia and Britain versus France and Austria. However, I should mention that Portugal, Spain, and Russia also got involved. Portugal on the side of Britain and Prussia, Spain and Russia on the side of France and Austria. Now, it was fought on 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and North America. We're talking a little bit more about all of these areas. Now, before we continue, one last thing you need to know, and I did not write it on here, but it's something you should start thinking about. One major motivation in European politics at this point is an idea called the balance of power. And if you want to write that word down on your notes, I would highly recommend doing it. Why? Balance of power was an idea in which it was understood by most diplomats of this period that you did not want to have a situation where one country or one alliance would emerge that was strong, that was so powerful that all the other nations of Europe together could not withstand it. And so, if faced with the prospect of such an alliance or such a country developing, other countries would quickly rally to form their own alliance to try to preemptively destroy it. So, when the Habsburgs of Austria married one of their young princesses, Marie Antoinette, to Louis XVI, it became incredibly obvious to those involved that we were dealing with a situation in which you had a Bourbon-Habsburg unity that, if it became more entrenched, would create a powerful Central European state that would be very difficult for the rest of Europe to withstand. So naturally, Britain and Portugal would have wanted to side with Prussia to try to break up this power. However, it's also important to note that Prussia's growing power within Germany and within the old Holy Roman Empire made them a threat to Russia, especially to Russia's westward expansions in the partition of Poland. Prussia would have been their strongest adversary in that region, and was one they were very happy to be rid of if they thought they could. So, prelude to war. So, the War of the Austrian Succession. The War of the Austrian Succession was fought a few years prior. It was fought over the territory of Silesia. We've already talked about the War of the Austrian Succession a little bit. But just to review, Maria Theresa, daughter of the Habsburg Austrian Emperor, the Emperor gets alliances, all agreeing that they will accept his daughter as his successor. Then the rest of his nobles renege on that once he's dead. While she's fighting to maintain her throne, Frederick the Great of Prussia swoops in and steals away the mineral-rich territory of Silesia. In order to try to get it back, Maria Theresa starts a war with Frederick. Because of, at the time, there had been a long-standing rivalry between the Austrians and the French, namely the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, France at that time joined Prussia. England, having a historic rivalry with France, jumped in on the Austrian side. Now, when that war ended, even though Austria was a victor, they were never made to return. Prussia never returned Silesia. Other territories were returned to Austria, but not Silesia. That was a sore spot. The Austrians wanted Silesia back, and so the 7 Years' War was their second attempt at getting it back. Now, the Battle of Fort Necessity occurred in 1754, and it involved a British surrender to French soldiers in the Ohio Valley. It also involved a young lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington, who unknowingly confessed to murdering a French officer. So how do you unknowingly confess to murder, I hear you ask? Well, what happened was in the aftermath of the battle, see, there had been a previous engagement before the Battle of Fort Necessity, in which Washington and Native American allies had attacked a French spying party, and an officer in that party had ended up killed in the battle. Now, when the French presented Washington with the Articles of Capitulation, the articles included the phrase l'assassin, or the assassin. However, or l'assassin, meaning the killing or the assassination. However, the murder or the assassination. However, the translator Washington had at the time did not render the word as assassinate or murder. When translating it to Washington, Washington was trying to figure out whether to sign the agreement. The word was rendered as loss or killing. Killing in the later translation when the document was brought back to Virginia. It was only much later that the British became aware of the actual French intention behind the phrase. But at that point, Washington had already signed the document. And this was used greatly in the international community to try to paint the British as the aggressors in the American theater, arguing that they had murdered a French officer in cold blood, and that one of their commanders had even admitted to it in the Articles of Capitulation of the battle. So, war in Europe. So, in the main area of Central Europe, Prussia was really the dominant party in these affairs, and he fought the Austrian army, the French army, and for a time even the Russian army. The British forces and the Hanoverian forces, meaning the forces of the House of Hanover, which George I, II, and III all belonged to, their soldiers tended to aid the Prussians. But the Prussians were the real superstars on the continent. Frederick the Great was, for all his many personality quirks, a military genius who was able to, when he got his information correct, he had an ample strategy. He was able to train a cavalry regiment that was able to fight in sync. His cavalry were charged in a way that was unheard of. They could charge next to each other, horses practically rubbing against each other, in a line that allowed them to decimate infantry forces. Far more effective than anything the Austrians, British, French, or Russians had. Prussia also had a highly disciplined infantry force. The Prussian army was the most disciplined army in the world. And with this, and Frederick is one of the main reasons for this army being so disciplined. Now, here's an example. The Battle of Lobositz. Lobositz was a battle fought on September 30th, 1756, and pitted the Imperial Austrian army versus the Royal Prussian army. Now, Frederick the Great attacked, unknowingly, the entire Austrian army, believing it to only be a rear guard. So he went into the foray with fewer forces than he would have otherwise. His cavalry was actually decimated. I wrote this wrong. Not cavalry, artillery. The improved Austrian artillery was brutal against the Prussian cavalry. However, Prussia was still able to prevail with heavy casualties. Several of Frederick's generals were able to successfully capture the hill of Lobositz and burn the town, forcing the Austrians to retreat, despite the fact that the Prussians were also marching in a valley and had the low ground. So, even though it was not one of Frederick's finest moments, it was still a remarkable way to pull out a victory, even against circumstances that were not looking favorably for the Prussians at all. Coming in with a smaller force, bad intel, they lacked the high ground advantage, and they had been anticipating an Austrian artillery which had been greatly improved from the last time they fought it. So now, what was Britain up to in the war? So, they did aid the Prussians on the continent. They also fought the French in North America in battles like the Battle of Quebec and the Battle of Louisbourg, Siege of Fort Ticonderoga, and the fall of Fort William Henry, which were all battles in the French and Indian War, as it was called in the Americas, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. During these battles, the British sent thousands of officers, although they were aided by colonial militias. The role of the colonial militias in these engagements is very important because that will become a major stumbling block between Britain and America over the issue of taxes that will follow. Now, they also, in the 1760s, Britain declares war on Spain, and they invade the Spanish territories in Cuba and the Philippines. One of the things that made the British so effective was their navy. The British Navy was the strongest navy on the planet, and it was Britain's naval strength. Remember, we talked about the strength of the British Maritime Empire. It was Britain's navy that really made them so powerful. It's what allowed them to move their army around the world, and it's what allowed them to engage in battles that were victorious. For example, the capture of Manila, the capture of Havana, the capture of Quebec, the capture of Louisbourg. All of these involved elements of the British Navy landing on islands or up rivers and using their abilities to support the land force. This is one thing that will become a constant issue, is that the real power in the British military at this period was the British Navy. The British Army was all right, but the British Navy was really the source of England's power. And if you can separate the British Army from the British Navy, it's not such a good time. We even see the role of British naval forces in the battles of Calcutta, which are fought during in India during this time, in which they sailed up the Ganges and were able to attack various parts of India. Now, India. Now, warfare was mostly through local rulers. We don't really see a lot of Britain fighting France directly in India. We really don't see that. What you see is the British East India Company engaging in battles with a pro-French Indian ruler of Bengal, or a local Mughal prince, or something like that maybe was more pro-French. You'll see that. Or you'll see British supporters backing up a local Indian ruler who's fighting against another local Indian ruler who's supported by the French. And a lot of that is what we see during this period. Another thing to make important is that a lot of this is done through these powerful chartered joint stock companies like the British East India Company and the French East India Company. And that European prisoners of war would often enlist with their captors rather than remain prisoners. So the British East India Trading Company actually had a very large contingent of French soldiers who had been agents of the French East India Trading Company, had been captured, and then agreed to enlist with the British East India Company. Now, Indian artillery took 15 minutes to reload, and this was a problem for two reasons. One, it was severely lacking compared to the European 2 to 3 minutes. But it was also the fact that when Indian forces would attack European forces, they often assumed that they had 15 minutes between one volley of cannon fire and the next time a cannon would fire, which is not what they had. And that was a problem, because it got a lot of them killed. Now, technology of the war. So, some tech that we're going to do with flintlock muskets. So, flintlock musket is a single-shot gun. That means you fire it, then you have to reload, recock the gun before you can fire again. Smooth bore, no rifling. And as a result of that, this weapon was highly inaccurate beyond 100 yards. The difference between rifling and non-rifling is kind of the same thing. The difference between throwing a basketball and throwing a football, if that makes any sense. And I'll explain a little more in a second.